The courtroom lights buzzed softly above, casting an even glow across the polished oak furniture and heavy velvet drapes that framed the judge's bench. There was a deceptive stillness in the room, a fragile calm built on procedural rhythms, rehearsed roles, and the expectation that the day's hearing would pass like the ones before it. But those who had been in court long enough could feel it. Something different hung in the air, a sharpness, a tension that seemed to vibrate in the silence before the storm. Pam Bondi sat still at the defense table, her hands resting lightly on a narrow folder, her eyes fixed on the witness in the stand, not blinking, not moving, just watching. The way a lion watches a single deer step too far from the herd. Her face was unreadable, but her body language radiated a quiet, unshakable certainty. Across from her, the prosecution shifted in their seats. They were visibly more confident. Their key witness had just finished his direct testimony. Clean, detailed, emotionally convincing. Too clean, Pam thought. Too smooth. The man in the witness stand, Christopher Vale, wore a navy blazer, a silk tie with a subtle pattern, and a self-satisfied expression. His performance was nearly flawless. He had painted the defendant as manipulative, cold, deceitful. He had recounted times, places, phone calls, each more damaging than the last. The jury watched him with interest, some with furrowed brows, others with quiet pity. But Pam hadn't written a single note during his testimony. She hadn't leaned over to whisper with co-counsel. She hadn't objected once. She had simply watched, not just what he said, but how he said it. The carefully spaced pauses, the practiced voice tremble, the glance toward the jury right after, every emotional beat. He wasn't testifying, he was auditioning. "Ms. Bondi," the judge said, snapping the silence, "you may proceed with cross-examination." Pam stood slowly, her heels clicking once against the marble floor. She picked up her folder, not a thick binder, not a stack of documents, just a thin, single folder, and walked toward the witness like she had all the time in the world. "Mr. Vale," she began, voice almost warm, "you've given us a lot to consider today. Let's start simple." He nodded, poised. "Of course. You testified under oath that on the evening of June 4th, you saw my client enter the office building on Westport Avenue at approximately 7:15 p.m. Is that correct?" "Yes." "And that you observed this from the cafe across the street?" "Yes." She smiled faintly, flipping open the folder. "What were you drinking?" "I'm sorry?" "That evening, at the cafe. You remember seeing my client from across the street, enough to identify him clearly. I'm assuming you were seated at a table. What were you drinking?" He hesitated. "A latte, I think." Pam nodded, flipping to the second page. "Almond milk or whole milk?" He blinked. "Does it matter?" "It does to me." "Please answer." He glanced toward the prosecutor's table. "Almond." "Interesting," Pam said, her voice light. "Because according to your public social media, you posted at 7:12 p.m. from that cafe, with a caption complaining they were out of almond milk." She walked over to the projection screen and clicked a remote. The post appeared, a photo of a half-empty coffee cup and the words, "Guess I'm going full dairy tonight. Out of almond milk again. Do better, coffee house." Time stamped. Geotagged. A few jurors straightened in their seats. One of them scribbled something down. Pam continued as if reading a bedtime story. "Now, Mr. Vale, you stated you saw my client walking through the glass doors of the office building at 7:15. Yet security footage shows that the cafe windows on that specific night were partially blocked by scaffolding from a construction project that began June 1st. She advanced another slide. A grainy nighttime image filled the screen, showing scaffolding covering nearly all sightlines from the cafe to the front doors across the street. "So please explain to the court how you were able to see through metal and plywood." Christopher's mouth opened, but no sound came out. Pam stepped closer, voice lowering just slightly. "And while we're on the subject of what you saw, let's talk about your angle. You claim to have had a clear view, from a table on the east side of the cafe, But according to this seating chart, the east side was closed that night for deep cleaning. Another document flashed onto the screen, an official maintenance notice from the cafe itself. Pam didn't look at the jury yet. She was still watching. Him? Still circling. "Mr. Vale, did you fabricate your testimony?" He shook his head quickly. "No. I might have been mistaken about the time, that's all." Pam raised a hand, stopping him mid-sentence. "So the time was wrong. The drink was wrong. The view was obstructed. The seating was closed. But your certainty about seeing my client remains rock solid?" He swallowed, loud enough to be heard in the front row. Pam turned, walked slowly back toward the defense table, then pivoted. "Let's revisit your relationship with the prosecution's key investigator, Detective Spencer." He stiffened. "It true that you and Detective Spencer were former college roommates?" "Objection. Sustained," said the judge. Pam nodded. "Let's rephrase. Mr. Vale, do you currently owe a debt to anyone in law enforcement?" He hesitated. No. Pam clicked the remote again. This time it was a screenshot of a court settlement. "This is a summary judgment from a small claims case in which you were ordered to repay a private loan to a Mr. Spencer. Same address, same employer, $5,000 outstanding." More murmurs in the courtroom. Pam finally looked at the jury. Not dramatically. Just enough. "Ladies and gentlemen, the prosecution's star witness has testified to seeing something that was physically impossible at a time that does not match posted evidence from a location that was closed to him with details that shift every time he's asked a question. And now, you know he has an unpaid financial debt to the investigator who brought him in." She turned back to the stand. "One more time, Mr. Vale. Are you lying to this court?" he stammered. I... Pam took one final step forward. "Because I already know the answer. I'm just giving you one last chance to say it yourself." And in that moment, the jury wasn't looking at him like a witness anymore. They were looking at him like a man caught in a lie so perfectly exposed, it didn't even matter what he said next. Pam Bondi didn't raise her voice. She didn't slam her hand. She peeled him open with facts, and the truth had nowhere left to hide. The courtroom had gone still, so still it felt unnatural, like sound itself had retreated to make room for something bigger. There was no clattering of pens, no rustling of papers, no shifting in seats. Just the sound of a man unraveling beneath the weight of a truth he could no longer control. Christopher Vale was breathing too fast now. His composure, once smooth and media-trained, had broken into something far less elegant. He tried to look down, but Pam Bondi wouldn't let him. Her presence held his eyes like gravity. The jury was watching too, all of them, wide-eyed, alert, no longer simply receiving information, but absorbing impact. Pam stood a few feet away from the stand, the silence growing thicker by the second. Then she broke it, not with force, but with a single surgical sentence. "You understand that perjury is a felony, correct?" He swallowed. "Yes." "And that if it's proven you lied under oath, you could face up to 5 years in prison for each false statement?" His voice cracked slightly. I didn't know some of the details were wrong." "That's not lying." Pam took a single step forward. "A mistake is forgetting whether you had 2 sugars or 3. A mistake is getting the street name wrong. But you claim to witness a man through scaffolding from a part of a cafe that was closed while drinking something you posted didn't exist, at a time when surveillance proves he wasn't even there yet." She tilted her head slightly, not in anger, but in devastating clarity. "That's not confusion. That's construction." He looked toward the prosecution's table, as if hoping they'd leap up to object, to intervene, to save him from the quicksand he had stepped into with both feet. But no one moved. The ADA sat frozen, his pen hovering over a notepad, eyes locked on the collapsing structure of his own witness. Pam let the silence stretch, then clicked her remote again. A new document appeared on the screen. "This is a time-stamped toll booth. Record. The license plate number is registered to a red Toyota Corolla, the same one you drive." The timestamp is June 4th, 7:10 p.m., exiting the interstate, 10 miles away from the cafe you said you were seated at. A low wave of noise swept through the gallery. No one gasped, not audibly, but the energy in the room shifted like a collective gasp had been felt. You weren't across the street, Pam said softly. You weren't even in the same zip code. Christopher Vale gripped the arms of the witness chair. His voice, now barely above a whisper, quivered with a kind of shrinking desperation. I was told it wouldn't matter. Pam's eyes narrowed. Told by whom? He didn't answer. Mr. Vale, she said more firmly. Who told you to testify to something you didn't see? He looked at the judge, then the ceiling, anywhere but her. I was just told they needed someone to connect the timeline, that it was already airtight, they just wanted a human piece, someone who could say it out loud. Say what out loud? Pam asked. A lie? His hands trembled. Pam held up a final document, just one page. This is your signed statement, submitted during discovery, which the prosecution claimed was written on your own volition. But forensic document analysis, performed 2 days ago, shows that the original draft was written not on your personal computer, but on a machine registered to the county prosecutor's office. The courtroom exploded, not with noise, but with movement. The judge's face darkened. The ADA jumped up, stammering. Your Honor, we object to the admissibility of... The judge raised a single hand. Sit down. Pam stepped back, folded her hands, and looked directly at the bench. Your Honor, I am requesting an immediate evidentiary hearing on the grounds of witness tampering and subornation of perjury. The judge nodded. Request granted. This court will recess and reconvene in 90 minutes. Mr. Vale is not to leave this building. Bailiff? Yes, Your Honor, the bailiff interrupted, already moving toward the stand. Christopher Vale looked like a man watching the trapdoor open beneath him, not in surprise, but in recognition. As if he'd known it was always there, and that it was only a matter of time before someone kicked it open. Pam returned to her seat without speaking. The courtroom buzzed like a shaken beehive, whispers and footsteps and stunned faces moving in all directions, but she didn't move. She didn't celebrate. She didn't smirk, because she knew what this meant. This wasn't the end of the witness. This was the beginning of the system falling apart around him, and she wasn't finished with it yet. 90 minutes later, courtroom 3B no longer resembled the chamber it had been that morning. The air was heavier now, charged with a strange combination of shame, fear, and inevitability. The kind of atmosphere that only descends when people realize the walls they thought were solid are, in fact, starting to collapse inward. Pam Bondi stood once more at the center of it, not as an intruder, not even as a disruptor, but as something rarer, a reckoner. She wasn't just here to challenge testimony. She was here to extract the truth, inch by painful inch, no matter who tried to bury it. Judge Hellman returned to the bench, his face visibly more severe. Whatever conversation had taken place in chambers during the recess had clearly carried weight. He shuffled through a small stack of papers, then looked up with the gravity of someone standing at the edge of something deeper than procedural law. This court is now reconvened for an evidentiary hearing into the conduct of the witness, Mr. Christopher Vale, and the potential manipulation of his sworn statement by agents of the state. The silence that followed was not passive. It was bracing, electric. Pam rose, her posture unshakably calm. Your Honor, I intend to demonstrate a deliberate, coordinated effort to manufacture testimony against my client, orchestrated through the misuse of prosecutorial authority and concealed beneath the veil of legal formality. The judge gave a slow nod. Proceed. Pam called her next witness, Caitlin Myers, a former junior clerk from the district attorney's office. She was young, no more than 28, with uncertain eyes and a nervous twist in her hands, as she was sworn in. But beneath her nerves there was something stronger, a desire to finally be heard. Pam approached her gently, like easing into deep water. Ms. Myers, how long did you work under ADA Colburn's direction? 2 years? And During that time, were you responsible for managing any documents related to witness statements? Yes. Do you recall processing a statement for Mr. Christopher Vale? She nodded. I do. Pam stepped closer. Was that statement drafted by Mr. Vale? Caitlin hesitated, her eyes shifting toward the judge, then toward her folded hands. Pam lowered her voice but made sure the jury could still hear. Tell the court what you told me in our private meeting. Don't worry about what it means for anyone else. Just tell the truth. A pause. Then a breath. No, Caitlin said. He didn't write it. There it was, spoken into record. Pam let it sit. She didn't leap on it, didn't dramatize it. She simply turned back to the judge. And who did? Caitlin looked down, then back up, more firmly this time. It was drafted in the office by ADA Colburn and Detective Ryan Felser. I was told to format it and backdate it to make it look like Mr. Vale had submitted it on his own, unprompted. Gasps finally escaped from the gallery. Quiet ones, but real. Shocked, human. Pam didn't react. She was still in the middle of the cut, still holding the blade. She turned back to Caitlin. Did Mr. Vale ever review or approve this version before it was submitted to this court? No, he wasn't even in the building. And why did you go along with it? Caitlin's voice broke. Because I thought that's just how things were done, that they knew something I didn't, and I needed the job. Pam stepped back, and for the first time all day, her voice grew just a touch louder. But you knew it was wrong. Yes, Caitlin whispered. I knew. Pam turned to the judge. Your Honor, I request that this document, she held up the forged statement, be struck from the record and replaced with the truth, which is that this was never the witness's testimony. It was the prosecution's story, written by their own hand, fed into this courtroom like poison. The judge didn't even hesitate. So ordered. At the prosecution table, ADA Colburn's hands clenched into fists. His mouth twitched with something unspoken, rage or panic or both. Pam didn't stop. She called her next witness, a digital forensic specialist. He testified with quiet precision, confirming that the metadata of the document showed it had originated from a computer at the DA's office, on a day when Mr. Vale had not even been present. The signature line had been inserted from a scanned image file. The timestamp had been modified using a document-altering plugin flagged in prior misconduct cases. When Pam returned to the center of the courtroom, the energy had shifted entirely. There were no longer whispers of if something had gone wrong. There was now only how much had gone wrong, and who else knew. Your Honor, Pam said, the defense moves not only to strike this witness's testimony, but to open an immediate inquiry into the actions of the prosecution in this case. We are not looking at a single lie. We are looking at an intentional effort to create a false version of events for the sole purpose of convicting an innocent man. The judge's voice was heavy now, nearly hoarse with the gravity of what he had to say. This court is no longer confident in the integrity of the evidence presented by the prosecution. I will be adjourning this case temporarily pending a full review of all documentation, testimony, and administrative oversight involved. He looked to the jury. You are dismissed until further notice. They filed out in stunned silence, their faces pale, their eyes darting. No longer jurors, but witnesses to a different kind of trial. One they had not been selected for, but which had been unfolding all along behind the curtain. Pam sat down. Her client beside her exhaled sharply, hand trembling as it passed over his eyes. You just saved me, he whispered. Pam didn't answer right away, because she hadn't just saved him. She'd exposed something far bigger, and the courtroom would never be the same again. The courtroom was technically in recess, but no one had left the building. Not the legal teams, not the clerks, not even the security detail. Everyone remained tethered to the moment, as if afraid that stepping away might allow the truth to slip back into the shadows from which Pam Bondi had dragged it screaming into the light. Down in the clerk's office, phones rang without pause. Reporters, Investigators, former defendants, attorneys from cases years old, all suddenly connecting dots they'd been afraid to even draw before. A quiet dread was seeping into the district. But alongside it, something else. Resolve. In the judge's chambers, the atmosphere had turned leaden. Judge Hellman stood before the long window, his hands clasped behind his back, staring down at the courthouse steps where a slow tide of onlookers and journalists had begun to gather. His voice, when it came, was low. "I never thought I'd see this under my watch." From behind him, his senior clerk cleared her throat. "Ma'am, Bondi's motion is airtight. She's going to request a mistrial within the hour." "She won't need to," he muttered, "because I'm going to grant it before she even stands." Upstairs, Pam Bondi sat alone at the defense table. Her team was down the hall, coordinating with the forensic expert, but she remained in that chair, unmoving, eyes fixed on the empty witness stand. It wasn't pride that held her there. It was something colder, deeper. Confirmation. She had known something was wrong from the moment the case file landed on her desk. The witness list didn't track. The sequence of evidence submissions was out of order. The entire narrative felt too neat, like a story sculpted by someone who had studied law not to seek justice, but to game it. And now, the cracks were no longer just visible, they were gaping. Christopher Vale had been escorted from the courtroom after the recess under quiet custody. No handcuffs. Not yet. But the expression on his face said everything. He was no longer a witness. He was evidence. ADA Colburn, on the other hand, was still at the prosecution's table, frozen in a kind of judicial purgatory, half defiant, half collapsing. His co-counsel had stopped whispering. No strategy could patch what had just happened. His laptop screen remained open to a blank document. Not a single word had been typed in 40 minutes. Then the door opened. The bailiff stepped in. "All rise." Judge Hellman entered with a solemn pace, sat at the bench, and looked out at the courtroom as if seeing it for what it was, not a place of order, but a scene of damage control. "This court has reviewed the testimony, the supplemental evidence, and the timeline of the events that have come to light over the past 24 hours. I have reached a conclusion." He didn't pause for effect. He didn't need to. The prosecution's case has been compromised beyond salvage. The credibility of the state's witness has collapsed under documented fabrication, and the alleged misconduct of the district attorney's office is under formal investigation. I hereby declare a mistrial. The gavel struck once. Final. The sound didn't echo. It landed. A strange sound broke out in the gallery, half gasp, half sigh. A mother of one of the jurors quietly began to cry. The defense's paralegal wiped their eyes. Even one of the bailiffs stared at the floor for a long moment, as if ashamed for ever believing any of it. Pam Bondi remained standing. She didn't celebrate. She didn't flinch. She looked directly at the prosecution table and said 2 words under her breath, just loud enough for Colburn to hear them. "You lied." And then, louder. "And we proved it." Colburn looked away. Pam turned to her client, who was trembling. Not from fear this time, but from the slow realization that he was no longer drowning. "You're free," she said quietly. "For now. But we're not done." He looked up. "What do you mean?" Pam's eyes hardened. "There are others. This isn't the only case they touched." And she was right. Because within hours of the mistrial being declared, 4 former defendants filed motions for appeal citing patterned misconduct in cases prosecuted by Colburn's office. A judge in another district unsealed an old case file that had long been flagged for irregularities. And a whistleblower stepped forward, anonymous. For now, but already speaking to federal authorities, Pam wasn't surprised, because corruption never starts with one lie. It begins with a culture of silence, of overlooked favors, of whispered shortcuts and unspoken debts. And when you crack that silence, it doesn't shatter clean. It spills. Pam Bondi didn't just dismantle a witness. She opened the floodgates. And everything that came next would be the consequence of truth being spoken when it was most needed. and most feared. By the next morning, the courthouse felt less like a place of law and more like ground zero. The mistrial ruling hadn't just shaken the building, it had shattered its illusion of integrity. Clerks whispered in corners, defense. Attorneys suddenly walked with straighter spines, and prosecutors, many of whom had once spoken with easy arrogance in these halls, now moved more carefully, their eyes flicking toward closed doors as if expecting them to explode. Pam Bondi arrived before sunrise. She didn't need to. The case was technically over for now, but she wasn't here to rest. She was here because justice doesn't clock out, and because she'd tasted the rot hiding beneath the courtroom robes, and she knew it didn't stop with Christopher Vale or ADA Colburn. That was just the surface. Her team was already waiting inside a makeshift operations room they had converted from an unused records chamber. Laptops open, legal pads spread like war maps, stacks of documents lined in color-coded folders. She glanced at the whiteboard and saw a fresh list of names added overnight. "Who are these?" she asked. Her co-counsel, Aaron Davis, stepped forward. All former defendants in Colburn's cases. Each one had similar procedural anomalies: fast-tracked motions, restricted evidence access, unlisted witness additions. We also found 3 other cases that used statements identical in structure to Vale's, same language, same formatting. 2 of those were supposed to be spontaneous confessions. Pam's jaw clenched. "Templates," she said. "They were template lies." Aaron nodded. "And it gets worse. Caitlin Myers is cooperating with the federal inquiry now. She's already turned over internal emails. One of them lists an actual phrase: build a bridge to conviction." Pam stared at her for a long moment. Then she turned and walked straight to the old metal cabinet in the back of the room. She opened it, pulled out the binder she'd labeled potential cross-contamination cases, and laid it flat on the center table. "Then let's build our own bridge," she said, "one that leads to every single case they touched." Just down the hall, ADA Colburn sat inside a closed-door ethics deposition. His attorney beside him looked 10 years older than he had the week before. The deposition room had no windows, no jury, no public gallery, but the pressure inside was nuclear. "You understand you're not just facing a bar review," the commissioner said calmly. "You're potentially facing charges of subornation of perjury, falsification of official court records, conspiracy to defraud, and obstruction." Colburn didn't answer. He couldn't, because in the space of 72 hours, he had gone. From predator to exhibit, and the city was watching. Outside, the media frenzy had begun to build. What had started as a quiet fraud case had exploded into a full-scale judicial scandal. Satellite vans lined the sidewalk. Headlines read, "Pam Bondi triggers legal earthquake in district court." "Witness collapse, opens floodgates, prosecutors, under fire." How a lie became a pattern, and a pattern became a system. In quiet moments, law students across the country watched footage of Pam's cross-examination like it was courtroom cinema. Legal bloggers posted frame-by-frame breakdowns of how she used each piece of evidence to corner the lie. One journalist wrote, "She didn't just expose him. She erased him." But Pam didn't care about fame. She didn't have a book deal lined up. No interest in guest appearances or Sunday morning panel shows. She wasn't building a brand, she was building proof. Proof that the courtroom could still work, if someone had the courage to challenge what had rotted inside it. That afternoon, she filed a formal petition with the District Review Board to initiate a full audit of every case handled under ADA Colburn during his tenure. Attached to the petition was a 92-page affidavit detailing inconsistencies, witness overlaps, metadata manipulation, and a shocking number of missing evidentiary files that had never made it to court. When she handed it to the review clerk, the woman behind the glass paused. "You're really going through with this?" Pam looked her in the eye. "I don't pull one thread to admire the unraveling," she said. "I finished the job." The clerk stamped the petition. It was done. By dusk, 6 more defense attorneys had reached out. One admitted, through tears, that he had seen something years ago but was too afraid to speak. One of his clients had served time. The man had died in prison. Pam didn't flinch. She added the name to her list. Quietly, solemnly. This wasn't just about clearing the wrongfully accused anymore. It was about dragging sunlight through the corridors of a system that had gotten too good at operating in shadow. That night, alone in her office, Pam stared at the wall where she'd pinned every thread. Photographs, names, court dates, case numbers. The lines connecting them no longer looked like theories. They looked like evidence. She picked up a pen and crossed one name off the list. Vale, Christopher. Then she circled another. Date, Ryan Felser. Because if Vale was the liar and Colburn was the architect, Felser was the engineer, and he was next. Pam Bondi didn't just destroy a lying witness. She detonated the structure that gave him a platform, and now she was walking through the smoke to find the ones who lit the fuse. The following morning broke not with calm, but with consequence. Before the courthouse even opened its doors, the air was thick with something undeniable. Change. Not the kind politicians promise or press releases pretend to announce. This was the kind that came after demolition. The kind that rises from rubble still warm. Pam Bondi stood at the window of her office watching the crowd gather outside. Journalists, protesters, law students, people who had been wronged and people who had simply watched others be wronged for too long. It wasn't a flash mob. It wasn't outrage theater. It was gravity. The world was pulling toward the place where something finally cracked, and she was at the center of it. A knock at the door broke the stillness. Her assistant leaned in, face pale with a mix of disbelief and awe. It's happening. Felser's been subpoenaed. Internal Affairs wants him on the record by noon. He lawyered up last night. No statement. Pam didn't react. She nodded once, calmly, like she'd known this would come. Because she had, she turned back to the case board. Once clean, now cluttered with evidence, photos, timelines, legal forms, printouts from sealed files now reopened by federal court orders. One corner was marked with red tape, unaccounted. These were the names that had slipped through. Defendants who had vanished into prison systems, or worse, those who had no advocates, no appeals, no voice until now. Pam stared at them, her jaw set. Find them all, she said. No one disappears under this system again. Downstairs, Felser entered the building surrounded by silence. No press briefings, no eye contact. He moved like a man already weighed down by the truth he'd denied. The halls seemed to lean in on him. Every door he passed a reminder of the courtroom where Pam Bondi had exposed the lie that started it all. As he entered the deposition chamber, federal agents logged his phone and ID. A court recorder clicked. Her pen. Across from him, 2 investigators opened their folders. No one spoke his name. They didn't need to. Pam, meanwhile, was already preparing the next round of motions. 32 in total. Each one a demand for case reassessment, evidence reinvestigation, or exoneration hearings based on contamination from the now-dead testimony of Christopher Vale and the shadowy reach of ADA Colburn's office. As she drafted, her co-counsel burst in. He flipped, she said breathlessly. Felser's naming names. Pam looked up slowly. How many? We don't know yet, but he's giving up the original template writer, the guy who created the fake statements. He worked on over 50 cases. They're calling it a conspiracy ring now. Pam's eyes darkened, but her voice stayed quiet. It was never just one lie. She stood, walked to her window, and looked down at the crowd. Someone had placed a cardboard sign on the courthouse steps. It read, "Truth matters." Pam proved it. She didn't smile. She didn't let herself feel vindicated, because for her, the goal had never been praise. It had been correction, restoration, rebalancing a system that had tilted so far into silence that it needed someone willing to speak louder than fear. Across the city, editorial headlines flooded in. The Bondi Standard, when justice has a backbone. Truth, teeth, and a suitcase full of receipts. Pam Bondi didn't break the system. She just showed us how broken it already was. Phone calls poured in. From D.C. law committees. from legal ethics boards, from defense organizations, asking her to speak, to advise, to help them build what she had just ignited. She accepted none of the interviews. She didn't need a platform. She was one. Late that night, in the quiet of her office, she returned to the board. Another name, circled in red, E. Whitlock, an appellate judge. One of Kessler's close confidants. His name had come up in Felser's testimony. She drew a single black line beneath it, another to cross. Because Pam Bondi wasn't finished, she'd exposed a lie, yes. She'd dismantled a witness, destroyed a prosecutor's credibility, and cracked open the sealed vault of institutional corruption. But now? Now she was building a new legacy from the ashes, one where no courtroom remained untouched by light, no voice stayed buried under bureaucracy, and no lie survived the sound of a woman who refused to sit down. She didn't just destroy a witness. She rewrote the rules, and tomorrow she'd do it again.